NBC's Hans Nichols, thank you very much. And joining us now, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, given the outcome of this meeting, the symbolism, but also some of the words the president used that seemed to catch many off guard, how do we cobble together something productive out of this?
Well, Mika, first, that's what I hope will happen.
Yeah.
We all have to hope and pray for our president's success and for progress towards peace. I far prefer the photo op in Singapore to 6 months ago when President Trump and Kim Jong-un were hurling adolescent insults at each other and terrifying the entire world that we might promptly go to conflict. So we prefer this. But frankly, North Korea, China, Russia, they had a great week. This was a dream outcome for Kim Jong-un, something his father and grandfather long hoped for: legitimacy on the world stage, an invitation to the White House, no concessions on human rights, and no clear concessions on a timeline or a process for denuclearization. So President Trump has secured only what two presidents before him, one Republican, one Democrat, got: a pledge to denuclearize, but gave up, I think, a lot of our prestige and leadership. How do we resurrect something from this? Well, first, the Trump administration doesn't yet have an Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, an ambassador to South Korea. This is a moment when the weakness of the State Department, the failure to put in place key advisors, I think may become a challenge, because Secretary of State Pompeo is promptly going to begin negotiating with North Korea under this agreement exactly how denuclearization might happen. And figuring out the details, the timeline of verification without having sanctions against North Korea fall apart is a huge challenge.
Senator Coons, it's Willie Geist. It's good to see you this morning. The president has said several times now over the last 3 hours after his summit broke up that he trusts Kim Jong-un, that he shaped him up. He sort of likes him. He said, I know he's a rough guy, but he loves his country. But he said he was intelligent. He said basically that he trusts Kim Jong-un. Should he?
Absolutely not. Kim Jong-un is one of the world's worst human rights violators. Later today, as the co-chair of the Senate Human Rights Caucus, I'm meeting with a group of North Korean defectors. And I'll remind you, back at the State of the Union, President Trump made it clear that he understood by highlighting the case of a North Korean defector and a young American who was brutalized in North Korea's gulag, just how dangerous a regime this is. What's happened in the last 6 months, or what's happened in the last 24 hours that has allowed President Trump to look in his soul and conclude that Kim Jong-un is talented, capable, and trustworthy? I don't know. We should instead be looking at his actual record on the ground. This reflects something that goes back to Trump as candidate, where he makes complimentary statements about dictators like Putin, Erdogan, Duterte, and in this case, Kim, yet picks fights, as he just did at the G7, with our longest, oldest, closest allies, democracies, developed Western countries like Canada, Germany, and the UK. I think President Trump would have been stronger going into this summit had he left the G7 in Canada with a united declaration of support for sanctions and for our negotiating stature. Instead, he left with the G7 in disarray.
Senator Coons, David Ignatius, your committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and you personally played a crucial role in overseeing the Iran nuclear negotiations and finally looking at the agreement. I want to ask you two things. What can you do in the Senate to try to help this process and keep it from falling apart, keep the standards tough? And second, if you would compare and contrast what happened today with the Iran nuclear agreement that Secretary Kerry reached.
Here's the most important development, I think, this morning. China is already calling for the UN Security Council to lighten sanctions on North Korea. To me, that is a very concerning development. Last week, I'll remind you, President Trump, his Commerce Department, had ZTE, a key Chinese telecom company, over a barrel, and I think let them up off the mat without getting key concessions, in particular of close partnership on confronting North Korea's nuclear weapons program. The Obama administration spent years building a multilateral, worldwide consensus to continue sanctions against Iran. Some criticized the Obama administration for not using that leverage enough to get a strong enough deal. I commend them for what was a very difficult effort. My concern is that the Trump administration really hasn't done their homework in terms of getting our key allies and, most importantly, one of our potential adversaries here, China, to the table and engaged on enforcing sanctions against North Korea. It's sanctions that got them to the table, and it is continued tough sanctions that will keep them from walking away. The Foreign Relations Committee has a key role here, David, in making sure that we promptly confirm nominees. We've got the new nominee to be South Korean ambassador, former Admiral Harris, in front of us this week. We don't have a nominee who's confirmable for the East Asian Assistant Secretary. We are really going to need seasoned diplomats to hammer out the details, and the Senate, on a bipartisan basis, needs to support what progress there may be. But it took years to work out the Iran nuclear verification regime, which was tough and searching and thorough. For this agreement with North Korea to mean anything, for it to be more than a reality TV handshake summit, there's going to need to be a lot of hard work in the months ahead, and I'm concerned that the Trump administration isn't prepared to do that hard work.
And Senator, if I could briefly follow up, would you encourage the committee to enact some measure saying that sanctions should not be lifted on North Korea until it meets certain conditions?
Absolutely. I think that would be an important, strong show of bipartisan support. We could combine it with embracing this diplomatic opening, with providing some encouragement and support. We also have legislation that I'm behind, that I'm co-sponsoring, that continues our pressure on North Korea for its human rights violations. I'll remind you, there's 100,000 North Koreans suffering in their gulag today. We can't ignore that. This is a dangerous regime, a nuclear-armed regime, and the Senate has an important role to play here in supporting diplomacy, but also holding this administration accountable.
Senator Chris Coons, thank you very much for being on the show this morning. Let's now bring in former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Rick Stengel, and former DOD official and former Executive Director